and he's make history. He's the first Asian American to run that far. And I want to add to you that he has a program initiative called Humanity Forward, which also has a podcast and has a program that Yen Speak that drew a lot of political figure in the country to exchange idea between himself and those political figures and known figures in this country. And you go to this podcast, you can see a lot of idea being exchanged. And besides this UBI that you already know so much about. Without further ado, I would like Andrew to spend a few minutes to talk about what's going on right now and his new idea and his new perspective. Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, everyone. And I just want to integrate my remarks with Marilyn and Donna's, because when you talk about what I'm working on, Ken, a lot of it is about elevating candidates who can become the next generation of Asian American leaders in this country. So Marilyn Strickland, so impressive, two-term popular mayor and then CEO of the Metro Chamber of Commerce. So she's like a practical, get something done doer that understands business, but understands people. She's running in a crowded field, a primary field that no one frankly knows who's going to emerge. But Marilyn is one of the favorites. And if she wins her nomination, she's going to, I believe, become the next member of Congress and a trailblazer out of Washington State. Donna just won her runoff. And so she's facing the 78-year-old incumbent. And something that I've heard through the grapevine is that her incumbent is ailing physically. He's 78 years old and not prospering. So despite the fact that he's got this war chest, he's not going to be able to do any meaningful campaigning, it seems like. So Donna's got a great chance to become the first Asian American member of Congress out of Texas. And I would urge everyone here that if they were excited about the prospects of Marilyn and Donna becoming the next Asian American members of Congress, just go support them, because they're at a point right now where if you lend your support to them, it could become the difference maker and them winning their races. It's a lot of fun working in congressional races because you don't need tens of millions of dollars. You just need tens of thousands of dollars. And I know there are people here that resemble that. So the reason why I want to tie in them to our work is that my organization, Humanity Forward, is trying to advance our ideas in various ways. Universal basic income is one, redefining the economy so that it revolves around people is another. It's more vital than ever. But our policies aren't going to become a reality unless folks like Marilyn and Donna become members of Congress. Because the fact is the political class responds most to wins and losses. Yeah. Like as soon as you win a race, then they're like, wait, what just happened? And I'm happy to say that Humanity Forward has already become the difference maker in various state level races. We already have essentially had people who supported my campaign. They're going to become the next state legislators in South Carolina or New York State. But the members of Congress, that's the next level. And I'm really excited about the fact that I believe that several people that we help elevate are going to become our legislators, and they're going to know it was because of this community. So please do support Marilyn and Donna. We can help them win. And none of the policies that I'm pushing for will become a reality without legislators like them. So Ken, that's a lot of what I'm doing. We've given $7 million in direct economic relief to people who are suffering in the COVID crisis. So that's been very positive and exciting. I've obviously been doing some work for Joe. I'm Zooming in for one of their campus kickoff events tomorrow, in addition to various fundraisers for Joe's campaign. I was just asked to start preparing a speech for the DNC convention. So those are some of the things that I'm working on. Really excited to help elevate some of the issues that are facing our community, including, unfortunately, the racism that has been surging as a result of COVID-19. So I also am working on a campaign to help with that. So those are some of the things I'm working on right now. And I know today's topic with Glenn, who's an expert in this, is about the US-China relationship. And unfortunately, all these issues are tied together. the
Yeah.
racism that we're experiencing as a community is tied to the future of U.S.-China relations.
Okay. Thank you. I know you've been quite busy in the main aspects of your program right now. Okay, let me go to Gwen. I met Gwen maybe once, at least, online before, and Gwen's right now in Tokyo. And Glen Fukushima, he's about our generation. He's a little bit generation ahead of you, Andrew. And if you actually look at his resume, he's a native California, educated at Stanford and also Harvard. And currently, he is the senior fellow at the Center for American Progress based in DC. So essentially, he traveled between California, DC, and also Japan. If I believe that's what you are doing right now, right, Gwen?
That's
And
correct.
yeah, so if you look at his lifelong experience transferred between corporation and government, between Asia and the United States. And that actually make his experience quite unique and eminently qualified to shed some light on the U.S.-Asia and U.S.-China relationship. And so in business and then also in government. So I don't want to go through his resume because if you go his resume, it will take about 70 pages. Probably that's what we end our discussion. So without further ado, I would like Gwen to speak a little about himself, his experience, something that it's worthwhile for us to know. Go ahead, Gwen.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you. Let me begin by thanking Andrew for inviting me to this forum to discuss U.S.-Asia relations. Just a couple of words about myself before I get into the topic itself. I am a Japanese American, third generation, grew up in California, went to elementary school in the San Francisco Bay Area, high school in Los Angeles, and college at Stanford. I spent some time in Japan and then went to graduate school at Harvard, spent 8 years there, then went on a Fulbright fellowship to the University of Tokyo, then practiced law in Los Angeles, worked at USTR, also the U.S. Trade Representative in Washington, D.C. from 1985 to 1990 on U.S.-Japan and U.S.-China trade relations and negotiations. And then I was in business for 22 years, primarily based in Asia. And since 2012, I've been at the Center for American Progress, a think tank in Washington, D.C. In the introduction, I think Ken mentioned Glen Fukuyama. Actually, my name is Glen Fukushima. And Fuku means good luck or good fortune, and Shima means island. But I'm sometimes confused with Frank Fukuyama, who's actually a friend of mine at Stanford. He and I were in graduate school together at the same time, and in the 1970s. And he's very famous because he's a prolific author, and probably the most famous book he wrote was The End of History and the Last Man. In any case, as an American of Japanese ancestry who spent much of my professional life working between the United States and Asia, I was very encouraged when President Barack Obama declared in a speech I attended in November 2009 that he was, quote, America's first Pacific president, obviously since he was born in Hawaii and spent part of his life in Indonesia as well. It wasn't until actually, I think he was at Occidental College for 2 years in Los Angeles, and then it wasn't until he was about 20 years old that he went to Columbia University, spent some time on the East Coast. So he really was a Pacific person until in the Pacific Rim until around the age of 20. A few months after he gave that speech in November of 2009, he announced the Asia Pivot, also known as the Asia Rebalance, in recognition of the importance of Asia to the future of America, politically, economically, militarily, technologically, culturally, you name it. I recall that when back in the 1980s, when I worked at USTR, that there were, that is obviously the U.S. Trade Representative, there were very few people of color working at senior levels in the U.S. government on foreign affairs. About 30 years later, when I moved back to Washington, D.C., in 2012, I was invited to participate in a seminar on a seminar called A Progressive Foreign Policy. And the featured speaker was David Miliband, who had been Britain's foreign secretary from 2007 to 2010. Now, at this seminar on a progressive foreign policy, I recall that there were 30 or so foreign policy experts from Washington who participated in the seminar. About 20 were white men and 10 were white women. I was the only person of color in this entire room, which really kind of surprised me because, especially as I mentioned, President Obama had announced the Asia pivot, and there was so much importance attached in terms of policy to Asia and the rest of the world. And yet there was not a single person other than myself of color in that room of 30 people to discuss a progressive foreign policy. This lack of diversity in senior government leadership, especially of Asian Americans, I think contributes to the perception that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners. Zbigniew Brzezinski during the Carter administration, Henry Kissinger in the Nixon administration, Madeleine Albright in the Clinton administration, Condoleezza Rice in the Bush administration, Susan Rice in the Obama administration. These people all served as head of the National Security Council or as Secretary of State without ever being viewed as foreign. But some Americans continue to view Asian Americans as foreigners. In 1982, the demonization of Japan during the trade conflicts led to the murder in Detroit by unemployed white auto workers of Vincent Chin, a Chinese American mistaken as a Japanese. In 2020, as Andrew mentioned, the demonization of China has led to numerous cases of anti-Asian American harassment and violence across America. As Asian Americans, I think we need to have a voice at the highest levels of the U.S. government to ensure that we contribute to an informed discussion and policymaking towards Asia, and to ensure that we are recognized as Americans with a legitimate stake in this discussion, along with other Americans who are of non-Asian ancestry. And I would also like to add at the very end that about 2013, since returning from Asia, I created with Dale Minami, a good friend of mine, an attorney, who probably many of you know in San Francisco, one of the leading civil rights attorney in the country. He and I started a PAC called Kappa 21. This is a PAC that was kind of based on the Coalition of Asia Pacific Americans, which was created about 20 years before. But the purpose of this PAC is to help to identify and to encourage and contribute to and support progressive candidates for political office, especially Asian Americans. And so we're very proud of the fact that in the 2014, 2016, and 2018 cycles, we've contributed to various candidates, including now Marilyn Strickland. And this is my first opportunity to meet with Donna, but I'd like to get to know Donna better and perhaps be able to help her as well through Kappa 21. So finally, Andrew, I look forward to discussing these and other issues with you today. And I also look forward to working with you going forward to ensure that our voices are heard in Washington, D.C. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Glenn. And today, I think we're going to spend a good amount of time on the U.S. and China relationship. It's the kind of topic which on the news almost every day. And as you know, that the tension between the two countries is escalating. And recently, the U.S. closed the Chinese consulate in Houston, which has to make it even worse. And so it's like, an imminent kind of divorce might be happening in between the U.S. and China. And today, actually, we have two lawyers. Glenn is a lawyer by training, also Andrew's a lawyer. But you want a divorce, you need a lawyer, right? The intermediate. But we don't have a law. We don't have a really intermediate between the U.S. and China. So it's good to have two lawyers here to talk about this and give us some solution as to how to solve this problem. And you know that about 3 years ago, the U.S. designated or labeled China as a strategic competitors. And you have to figure out what it means. What is a competitor between, the U.S. and China? What are we competing? So I remember more than 10 years ago, Steve Jobs, remember the founder of Apple, wanted to crash Google. That's he stated publicly. He wanted to crash Google, right? Why do you want to do that? Because he found out that Google was developing a software called Android to want to compete with Apple. So he was so upset that he kicked out, Eric Smith. At that time, he was Google's chairman, also sitting on the board of Apple. So he was so upset. I mean, you know that this is the competition. And you know the rest is the history between Google and Apple. They're still doing pretty well, both of them. Okay, the question is that what is competition, between US and China? It could end up in win-win situation between the two countries. Could be a lose-lose. Could be a zero-sum kind of thing. One lose, one gonna gain. And let's talk about this. So we can talk about in the area in terms of competition in technology, economic, political, etc. Let's pick technology, okay? Because you heard the news that lately that this possibility, this very popular video application in the United States called TikTok may be banned. So this is real, it might be, the case in the near future. So I want both of you to let us know your opinion about if this kind of thing goes on in terms of competition between the two countries in technology, what's going to lead us? Maybe Glenn, you want to talk about this?
Okay, I'll start. And technology is an area I'm very interested in. I worked in Silicon Valley for 4 years, heading the Japan operations of a major software company, Cadence Design Systems. And while I was at USTR, actually, I worked on issues like semiconductors and supercomputers. And it was a very interesting parallel between the 1980s, when we were doing negotiations on US-Japan semiconductors and supercomputer issues, and now, where the US and China are competing in high technology. I think one of the things that I'd like to point out is, although I know that your real interest is China, I think it's really important to look at the context of the US-Asia relationship and how China fits into that, number one. I also think it's very important to understand history. And I think that we can't really understand the US-Asia relationship without understanding the history of where China started from in the relationship with the United States centuries ago, and the consciousness among many Chinese that they are trying to restore their role in the world as it used to be. And so both the historical aspect and the geographical context are both important, but specifically, and so we can get into that later. But on technology, I think it's very true that China has a plan, a long-term plan to advance in high technology. And the best way for the United States, in my view, to deal with that is to make our own investments in education, research and development, in universities, and try to have a healthy competition between the US and China. If there are areas in which there are unfair practices or practices that don't conform to international rules like the WTO rules, then I think the US needs to take action. And I think it's quite true that many American companies face problems in China in getting market access or losing intellectual property rights or having to give their technology in return for the opportunity to invest or trade or do business. So I think that we need to make sure that we have a level playing field, but we also have to have in the United States a policy that will promote high technology and promote the advance of technology, so that we're trying to promote and create more wealth, more technology, and be competitive in that regard. Not only in terms of preventing China, for instance, in selling its Huawei products into the United States or Britain or wherever. Yep. So that's just my initial comments. I can go on for several hours on this, but Andrew, let me turn it over to you.
Well said. Okay, Andrew, how about your opinion?
The fact that China essentially started adopting its own mobile operating system in opposition to Android, I thought was like a major shift, because, and it wasn't all like they were trying to not do it because their software wasn't ready. But then they felt they had no choice, and then they were pushed to do so. And then Google was pushed to make a change by the US. And so to me, that was the big fork in the road, where now China is trying to develop its own tech infrastructure, software, hardware. And so you're winding up with two parallel tech ecosystems, which is really not what anyone wanted, I believe. Certainly not what the West wanted, because there was an extended period where Western software was being used for a lot of things in China, and China's trying to sort of wean themselves off of it. So TikTok, to me, is one of the first genuine Chinese social media incursions into the Western market, where like the American teens, the kids, just love TikTok, love it, can't get enough of it. It is quite addictive if you've used it. And the fact that now the U.S. is looking at, oh my gosh, are we going to let this Chinese social media company run our kids' lives, which is essentially what's happening. Like they're staring long and hard at it. And to me, this is a very fascinating question. I think there's a legitimate case to be made for banning TikTok, which is unfortunate because that's not what you want. But if you're in an environment where you're developing parallel tech ecosystems, the last thing you want is a Chinese company that necessarily has access to a lot of kids' data in that way. If you're at this point, which unfortunately we're heading towards, the problem to me is that we're where we are right now. And one of the open questions is how much that will change under a Biden administration, because you've seen a consistent worsening of the relationship between U.S. and China with Trump over the last several years. And I'd heard from people who talked to folks in China that China's actually rooting for Trump to win because it's going to continue to have the U.S. vacate a position of American leadership, global leadership, where if the U.S. is disengaged from the rest of the world, then China can come in and say, well, it's us, we'll spend money on infrastructure development here, we want to have a better relationship. And other countries will look up and say, wait, well, the U.S. is nowhere to be found. So if China wants to come and is willing to pay, then let's further the relationship. So the question is how much of that is driven by Trump? And I know that Joe is naturally very internationalist and bent, and I believe he'll want to try and fill the vacuum of global leadership. Does that change our interaction on the tech landscape? Perhaps, is my thinking. And so that to me is one of the great questions to be answered when Joe's our president. I believe Joe will be our next president. And so when Joe wins and is inaugurated in 2021, does the U.S.-China relationship change dramatically?
Yeah, but
Well,
do you see?
Could I address that point?
Go ahead.
I agree with Andrew that the relationship will change actually between the U.S. and China if Joe Biden becomes president, because although the consciousness of the issues that we face with China may remain, the way in which we deal with it will change, I think. And number one, I think a Biden administration will have a strategy and goals as to what we want to accomplish. I think the Trump administration has been very unsystematic all over the lot. There's no clear, consistent strategy about where they're headed, what the goals are, what they really want to accomplish. Number one. Number two, I think that the Trump administration has been too much focused on being America first and trying to do everything alone without working closely with our allies. I think that, if you go to Europe, you go to Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, I mean, all these countries would like to cooperate with the United States on a number of issues, but especially including China. And I think that China's presence is so large and so powerful that it's really unrealistic to expect that the United States on its own is going to be able to deal with these issues, especially in technology. I think we need to be cooperating much more closely with our allies. So that's the second area which I think would be different. Number three, I think that the Trump administration on the economic side has been focused primarily on tariffs. I mean, Trump has said, I'm a tariff man. I love tariffs, and trade wars are easy to win. But I think there's just a whole range of other ways, mechanisms that the U.S. can deal with China in addition to tariffs. And so I think that whole panoply of issues is something that the administration needs to consider much more strongly, and also working with the American companies, with the American academic community, and others. Now, there are areas in which I think the U.S. and China can and should cooperate. There are global issues like climate change, global issues like terrorism, natural disasters, pandemics, nuclear non-proliferation. These are all areas where the U.S. and China can cooperate. So in areas where we can cooperate, we should definitely cooperate. I think the fundamental thing is we should look at China as a rival, but not as an enemy.
Right. Let me get back to this point again. I mean, Huawei is different from TikTok. I mean, we are talking about privacy issue and we're talking about national security issue here. And do you agree that if TikTok is going to be banned by the US, what does it mean to the world in terms of China has one technology base and we bifurcated into two camps, US and China? Is it going to be the way how we're going to conduct our life in the future? What do you think?
Well, that's the clear direction that things have been headed. And Huawei, having your 5G tech infrastructure is one set of security issues, which obviously the US came down hard and said that they don't want their network operated by Huawei. TikTok's a whole totally different set of issues, but there is a legitimate concern that there's a lot of data being passed through any social media network. And in this case, like you don't know where that data is going, particularly where in the case of TikTok, a lot of it's video. It's like could you build a giant facial recognition database based off of like people's TikTok videos? Probably. Like there's certainly a reason to believe that one could. So I wish that Chinese cell phones still operated off of Android. I thought that was very, very good. But the Chinese at one point they decided, look, relying upon Western tech is a bad place to be, and so they've tried to move off of it, and they've already experienced the worst pain, because when they got off of Android, they had this frankly inferior operating system that they then foisted on everyone, and everyone was like, what the heck is this? Like this is terrible. But then they've had some time to improve it and make it it's still not as good, but it's not terrible anymore. So that was like the bitter pill that they swallowed already, Ken. And so now that they've swallowed that pill, I think there's no turning back on their side.
Yeah. So what would be your solution to the TikTok case? What was the best solution to solve this kind of conflict between the US and China?
Well, one of the reasons why I think TikTok may head in a certain direction, Ken, and this is going to make me sound like a fuddy-duddy, but it's unclear what not having TikTok would do in the West in terms of irreparable harm. You know what I mean? Like, it's been on the scene for just a number of months. It's primarily people entertaining each other. Like, if you were to ban TikTok in the United States of America, there would be a Western originated TikTok clone in approximately 1 minute. And then you'd wind up with another version of it. So I think that's a distinct possibility.
Yeah. Grant, I can ask you one question. If TikTok being purchased by a Japanese company, or a Japanese company being the majority owner of TikTok, would that solve the problem?
Well, I don't know if that would solve the problem, but I think that there would have to be examination of what the ownership structure, what implications that would have for the future of the technology, but also in terms of data privacy, data access. And I think one of the fundamental problems that we face in this tech competition between the US and China is that there are many ways in which security, national security, military security can be implicated. So, I mean, in my view, if TikTok is acquired by, say, a Japanese company or whatever, and the concerns about data privacy, data access, about government intervention, government control, if those are dealt with and they go away, then I think that would be a positive development.
I also want to say that American consumer data is getting sold and resold and packaged and repackaged by Western tech companies. Our data is getting handled by many outfits that people don't really recognize or realize. It's just that in the case of, let's say, Google or Facebook having that data, no one gets as alarmed. But I just want to make that point that our data is getting handled by Western tech companies all the time.
Yeah. Well, the paradox for other countries, including Europe and Asia, is that they have to choose they have to make or forced to choose between US or China in terms of this technology. So of course they want to use both. They don't have to be forced to choose. What do you feel about this? If the world is really bifurcated into two camps?
Well,
of
here's what it means when you talk about like the default tech platform in many spaces, in many places, has been the West. I mean that's just
Yeah.
so when you talk about like openness and people being able to choose whatever they want, they're going to choose the Western product a lot of the time because it just has like the most track record in many of these spaces. And you could argue that China was very smart to say, look, we're going to protect our market and then give rise to our own tech companies. But if you had like it's one of the things that's happening where China is essentially buying customers, where it's going to various developing countries and saying, look, we're going to invest in your infrastructure, but oh, by the way, you should really use our software for things. And then some of these countries are like, all right. So if you look at their mobile operating system, it's being used by like a handful of developing countries, all of whom China's invested in.
So I go back to my previous point that it's really important for the United States to invest and to develop technologies, whether certainly the companies themselves and entrepreneurs and the innovation in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, it's very important in order to maintain our competitiveness. But when it comes to certain technologies that implicate national security, I think it may merit investigation for the U.S. government also, including the Defense Department, to be involved in trying to promote or encourage the development of technology, because I think if the U.S. only presents kind of a defensive posture, where we're saying we're going to countries and say, well, don't choose China, but if China is producing, high technology, leading edge, innovative products and services, especially if they're cheaper than offered by other countries, then clearly, the buyers are going to prefer those. So I think we need to have a much more proactive policy of investment in developing our own technology. So we can
one thing, and I'd love to answer some of the questions that are in the chat window, but one thing we have to really work to make a distinction on, if you look at this meeting today, we're all on Zoom. And Zoom is a Chinese American company, and like now everyone's using it and whatnot. We have to take great pains to distinguish between Chinese American companies and then Chinese companies, and just make sure that no one ever gets them confused, because that's super painful. Like I think it was, like a legislator referred to Zoom as a Chinese company, and it pained me because I don't believe that's how we should be talking about a company like Zoom.
Yeah, it's very important. But I also think that, we have to be very careful in also distinguishing, between Asian Americans on the one hand and Asians who are not U.S. citizens on the other, because I think the whole, group of legal protections and rights and privileges that Asian Americans have, we should make very clear that, we are the same as other Americans. And I think that distinction is very important. And sometimes I find in the Asian American community that there's a little fuzziness in that, in not making clearly the distinctions that need to be made. And certainly as a Japanese American whose father was interned in 1942 for looking Asian and looking Japanese, although he was a U.S. citizen born and raised in the United States and fought in the U.S. military after that, that distinction is very important for us to keep. I agree with Andrew.
Yeah, I agree with you, Brandon. You stated very clearly that in order to compete, we got to invest. We got to attract the best people to come to the state.
Yeah.
That's the case. Why our government, they already have got the best brain from China in the United States already, right? They have about 400 students in the United States, the best brain from China. Why are we making them so nervous? Not actually calming them down so they can stay here.
That's right. We have to roll out the red carpet, like treating every Chinese graduate student like an espionage agent is a disaster. It's like a lot of these people, obviously, like they could stay and build careers and families and lives here, and they want to, but they don't want to if they're going to be like suspected of espionage at every turn. I mean, like it's just common sense. Like Jack, I think you asked a question about how I would summarize the Joe Biden administration's approach to China. Obviously, it's premature, but the word that popped into my mind was engagement. Like I think Joe wants to engage, and that's not just with China, but that's with the rest of the world. I don't think Joe is the sort of person who believes that you can solve international or global problems by um, just threats and bullying or bravado. I think you'd have a more robust conversation. And what Glenn said is right, is like, look, there are things, if a US-China relationship is functional, it's like a good relationship between, let's say colleagues or companies where you'd say, look, we agree on these things or can agree and work together. We don't agree on these things. Let's just make progress on the things we do agree on. And then we can try to engage on the things we don't agree on. That, I believe, is Joe's natural inclination, though obviously it's premature because he has to win and then appoint a Secretary of State and a bunch of other things. But I know that, I think that Joe's going to have a much more three-dimensional approach.
Well, when Joe Biden had his joint fundraising event on June 23rd with former President Obama, one of the last question that was asked was about foreign policy. And Joe Biden said, as soon as I'm inaugurated, the inauguration of Joe Biden on the 20th of January of next year, he said, I'm going to pick up the telephone and call the heads of states of all of our allies and tell them, America is back. America is back. So I think I agree with Andrew. He really does want to engage, and I think Joe wants to work with our partners and allies. And I think that's one of the fundamental things that is lacking in the Trump administration. And as Andrew was saying before, the Chinese leadership really, whether they say it or not, they want Trump to be reelected, because if Trump is a president for another 4 years, it's clear that he's going to weaken America's allies, the alliance between the United States and Europe, United States and South Korea, United States and Japan and other countries. So weakening alliances is something that the Chinese leadership would love for the U.S. to do. And secondly, Trump will be withdrawing from the world. He's already said he's going to, withdraw a fourth to a third of our troops in Germany, and he's asking Japan for 4 times more and South Korea about 3 times more for host nation support. And there's clearly going to be in the second term a withdrawal, which also would be to China's benefit. So I think they're really rooting for Trump to be reelected. On the other hand, I think Biden will engage with the world and will be much better off for that.
Okay. Let's move on a little bit to the trade competition. I know that you have some opinion about the trade, what the current administration has been doing with trade with China. What have you learned from it? What would you do differently?
So you're asking me,
Andrew?
or Andrew?
I feel like
maybe
you worked in this
Glenn.
area for a while, so I feel like I want to defer to you, since you actually were the US
Yeah,
trade
maybe
representative.
Glenn, you were yeah.
Yes.
Glenn was a trade representative for the United States. Go ahead, Glenn.
So, from 85 to 90, I worked at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. In the first 3 years, I was a director for Japanese affairs, and then the last 2 years, Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan and China. Unfortunately, 1 year after I got in the job in 1988, Tiananmen Square happened in 1989. So that meant that there was not much going on between the U.S. and China in terms of trade negotiations. But Bob Lighthizer, the current U.S. Trade Representative, is someone I overlapped with for 1 year in 1985 when I joined USTR.
Was he your boss? Is he your boss?
He was not my boss. At that time, there were 3 deputy USTRs, 1 in Geneva, 2 in Washington, and my boss was Ambassador Michael Smith, who was involved, who was in charge of bilateral negotiations. So I reported to Michael Smith. But every Monday morning at 8:30, we had a senior staff meeting, and so I would see Bob Lighthizer, and we had the opportunity to discuss trade issues in those senior staff meetings with the U.S. Trade Representative. So, I think that Bob and a number of others like Peter Navarro have had this view of China as being just basically taking advantage of the United States, and just one way taking all the advantage, and leaving the U.S. with companies that have become bankrupt, with workers who've become unemployed. They just have, I think, a very zero-sum view of China. I think that it's very clear that we can benefit from having trade with China, but I think that we need to kind of adjust things to make sure that China abides by the rules that it agreed to, like, for instance, when they joined the WTO. I mean, one of the things, I mean, Bob Lighthizer had a testimony in March and in June in the U.S. Congress, and he expressed, the Trump administration's frustration about the WTO. And I actually think in the second term, if things don't change there, that the U.S. would withdraw from the WTO, just as it withdrew from the WHO, World Health Organization. But I think
Yeah.
that would really be terrible, because I think the WTO, for all its faults, still provides some useful functions, and the whole point is to reform the WTO and work with other countries, like-minded countries, to do that. And I think it's possible. And so I think that, trade certainly can benefit the U.S. and Japan, U.S. and China both, but we need to make sure that China abides by the rules that have been set, that it's not always following, especially in areas like intellectual property rights and
Yeah.
subsidies of state-owned companies.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
And-
to the question. I mean, trade is obviously arguably the central component between the two countries, and makes up, I think, something like half of all global commerce, just between the U.S. and China. The thing that many of us are concerned about on this call is that it seems like we're on this path towards a Cold War that may already have been declared, and I think someone recently came out and said it could get worse than that. And trade has been one of the bonds that has arguably helped bring the U.S. And the Chinese together or closer. I mean, there are problems and abuses, but still, generally speaking, you don't have open conflict with your number one trading partner. And this to me is to me the great difficulty of our time, to try and improve this trajectory. And we all saw that the U.S. closed the Chinese consulate in Houston, was it 3-4 days ago, or made that announcement several days ago, on charges of espionage. The thing that's the most worrisome is that it's become essentially politically unpalatable to say anything that's not negative or adversarial about China. And it's become something of a punching bag. And also very problematic is that the Chinese have started to follow suit, where a number of years ago, when Chinese looked up to America, and the Chinese government didn't have as uniformly negative messaging around America, but then the tensions have increased. Unfortunately, the animosities on that side too. This is such a massive concern, and obviously, as Asian Americans ourselves, this racism we've seen with COVID-19. I did not anticipate COVID-19, obviously, because in this way, but I did anticipate and was always concerned about, if you had worsening relationships between U.S. and China, that Asian Americans would get stuck in the middle. And unfortunately, that timeline's gotten sped up, and it's going to be Asian Americans who help hopefully change this dynamic, because I think it's vital to the future of the world that we change this dynamic. And one thing that's going to be helpful is having Asian Americans like Marilyn and Donna as members of Congress. And so that anytime someone looks up and they see that, their representative looks like an Asian American, I think that can help people realize that we are just as American as they are or anyone else is. And that we can be something of a buffer or bridge to help normalize being Asian and American. And I think that my race helped in that regard, though obviously, there's much work to be done. But it's one reason why I ran and was proud to run, is that I thought having an Asian American on the debate stage would remind people that we are here in a vital part of this country. And it's going to be a massive challenge, because you can see very clearly, it's almost like an earthquake where the tectonic plates are shifting. And the tectonic plates are shifting in a way that are unfortunately bringing the U.S. and China more at odds, and increasing tensions and the possibility for conflicts of various kinds.
Yeah,
So I
thank
agree
you.
with that, but I also think that, as Andrew mentioned, we need to have elected representatives who look like us and also can talk intelligently and with authority about the U.S.-Asia relationship. But I think we also need to have people in the administration itself who are not elected officials, but bureaucrats and
People
others
doing the work. Yeah, I agree. Just
who-
people doing the
who
work. So
have
you're
that
not in the room alone,
expertise.
Glenn.
And I think that having Asian Americans can really contribute to having a plus sum relationship with Asia and not a zero sum relationship.
Yeah. Grant, since you spent a lot of time in Asia, and you also know the dynamic in Japan and Korea and East Asia well enough, do you have any feeling about what people think about the relationship between US and China? Are they being squeezed in the middle, or they just have to find their own way, to
Well,
live around the two giants? What's the people there think, So
so that's an excellent question. It's a very complicated question because for two reasons. Number one is that it varies by country. I think each country has a different relationship with China, and each country has to deal with China based on that, as well as number two, history. The
yeah,
whole history of China's relationship, whether it's with Vietnam or with Korea Peninsula or with Japan. I mean, so it's a very complex question. But one of the things that's very important for the United States is to have people in Washington who understand the complexity of the issues, who have some knowledge of the history, who can read the language and speak the language and understand what's going on in Asia, because it is very complex what's going on. I think the rise of China has really changed the landscape over the last 20 or 30 years. And countries like South Korea, like Japan, I mean, these countries, and Australia, they've become increasingly dependent on China, especially on the economic side. But they face a real dilemma because on the economic side, they have generally prospered by trading with China, investing with China. However, on the political side and on the security side, you look at the South China Seas, you look at the problems in Hong Kong,
yeah, yeah.
problems in Taiwan, the treatment of the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority. There are all these human rights issues, there are security issues, there's technology issues. So, on the one hand, there's the prosperity and positive elements. I'll give you one final example. Australia is a really interesting case. I've spent several visits to Australia. The Australians basically said to me, look, until recently, we were very optimistic because we felt that we could rely on the United States as a dependable partner. We saw Japan as a reliable trading partner and investment partner, and China was rising, and we benefited from that. Everything was going so fine. Well, just within the last few years,
I think we lost him.
We lost a little bit here. Yeah.
I was like precisely at 8. It was like a pumpkin.
other than in the economy, that is on the
Oh, wait, now
political
we're
side.
back.
As you know, there have been a number of problems in Australia where the Chinese have funded politicians to have them
Yeah.
change their views on the South China Sea and so forth. So this interplay between the politics side and the security side on the one hand and the economic side is a real dilemma for
Right.
all these countries of Asia. And in each country by country, it's different, and we need to have people in Washington who understand that complexity and the history and where the United States can play a positive role.
It's a very important point you make here, Graham. As American, you know about America, we know about Asia. Asia has a lot of neighbor. You go to Europe also, everybody has a neighbor, right? But America doesn't have neighbor, only except the English neighbor in the north.
Canada and Mexico.
Right. Yeah, so you don't have to, America doesn't have to deal with neighbors, right? So they do not have to understand the intricacy, complexity with the neighbor kind of relationship. Don't you think that that's a kind of thing that we should do better, in this way?
Yeah, absolutely. But in some sense, the U.S. and China have some similarities in that regard. And we were both big, powerful countries, and so we don't
Yeah.
have to think as sensitively about Canada or about Mexico. And in the same way, I think China feels increasingly so powerful that they don't need to think that sensitively about whether it's Cambodia or Laos or other smaller countries where China is exercising a lot of influence because of its
Absolutely.
economic power.
It's a good point. It's a good point. All right, that's a good point. I think we are what, Don? We are what, drawing to a little bit the closing time right now. What do you feel now?
Yeah, I think it maybe give two speakers each one like 1 minute to,
Motion, yeah.
and then I'm going to make an announcement for the next month's event. Thank you.
Okay. I think what Don wanted is that some closing remark from you both, and then we would let Don announce about the next meeting. Okay. Okay, Grant first, and then maybe Andrew the second. Okay, Grant.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share some views with all of you. I think there have been some really interesting issues and important issues that have been raised. I think it's really important for Asian Americans to be engaged both in terms of electing officials who are Asian Americans and who represent and display the values that the Asian American community represents. Also, I applaud Andrew for his efforts in the presidential campaign and bringing to light a number of major issues, especially on the economic side, but also on the racial and cultural side as well. I think the next administration is going to face a huge set of problems. It's the economy, coronavirus, public health, Black Lives Matter, foreign policy. There's a whole range, climate change. There's just lots and lots of issues that need to be dealt with. And I think for the last 4 years, many of these issues have been ignored or been exacerbated, including in trade. So I think the next administration, the Biden administration, will have the opportunity to really kind of reform, repair, and restore a lot of what America stands for in the world. And I really hope that Asian Americans will be able to contribute to that effort. And I really look forward to working with Andrew and his colleagues and friends and supporters to make this a reality. And I'm actually very optimistic about the next administration and what we can do. And so today's discussion was just, I think, just the start. We just kind of scratched the surface because there's so many issues, not only U.S. China but U.S. Asia, because Asia is the dynamism, the growth of the world, economically, technologically, and I think we really need to focus our efforts there and really have people in the government in the United States, both on the elected side and non-elected side, who have some experience and knowledge about the area. So thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss all these with you, and I really look forward to future opportunities as well. Thanks.
Okay, Grant. Okay, Andrew.
Oh, thank you all for being here tonight. I love these sorts of convenings because it's many people who are leaders in the Asian American community who want to improve our country and this set of relationships that's going to define our futures, our kids' futures. I think there are two things that I would think about big picture. I do believe that we cannot know what the U.S.-China relationship will be like until Joe's in office and you have a new Secretary of State, new staff, new teams. I do believe that Joe's going to build many senior Asian American leaders into his team because I've heard him say something to that effect. And I believe him. I believe he's sincere. So the U.S.-China relationship will have an opportunity for something of a reset or a change. I believe that there's going to be a real appetite for a different dynamic on the U.S. side, and then it's an open question whether China will be similarly open. And I believe the challenge will be to present to the Chinese side that it's in their self-interest for a different kind of dynamic, but there's a very real opportunity there. And then you have what's going on in the U.S. itself. And the fact is, this country is struggling at an historic level. 72% of Americans think that this is the worst time in recorded history for them, worst time in American history. It's one reason why I believe Trump's going to lose, because if you have 72% of Americans who believe it's the worst time in their living memory, that's not good for the incumbent. So we're facing mammoth challenges here in the U.S. that unfortunately I think are going to wind up with Asian Americans in the middle, where you have an economic crisis. And people are looking for scapegoats, clearly, for COVID, and we are being scapegoated for just because people are looking for someone to blame, and Trump's trying to distract with the China virus, and then this decline in U.S. global stature, people are looking for someone to blame, and that's also China. So to me, one of the main reasons I ran was to try and improve the American way of life, because if you improve the American way of life, then I believe that that's actually much better for people's ability to accept different types of people as fully American. And also, I think it can help us evade this Thucydides trap that some people are chatting about in the question. Whereas if you have two great powers, that there must necessarily be like a clash or a rivalry or a zero-sum game that results in some form of conflict. To me, like if you just say, hey, Trump is terrible, which I believe he is, and that Joe Biden will come in and become reasonable and will fix things, I believe that's like a piece of the puzzle. But I believe the other equally significant or even more important piece of the puzzle is that the American way of life is disintegrating. It's crumbling. And it requires this mammoth investment and reinvention, not just of our relationship with global trade partners, but with what the heck is going on in terms of the American economy and who's winning, who's getting left behind. More and more Americans feel like they are not participating in the global economy. And then so if you turn to them and say, hey, it's China's fault, like let's isolate the country, many people will be receptive to that. So we cannot try and address these global issues in the US-China relationship unless we seriously examine what's going on with the American way of life here. And that extends well beyond our community. It's one reason why my campaign looked the way it did. I believe one of the best things that Asian Americans can do is start to address some of the bigger issues in our society, the racial issues, the economic issues. And a big component of that is going to be supporting people who are running for office that we'd like to see win. Asian Americans have historically not been that political, present company accepted, but we need to engage on that level. We need to engage in issues that aren't just germane to our community, because if we don't do that, then I believe our community is going to end up feeling the brunt of some of the problems, honestly. So thank you for coming together tonight. Thank you for stepping up on behalf of our community. Please do step up for Marilyn and Donna and anyone else who's running for office that you want to see win. They're going to do something that I did not do in 2020, which is win their election. So let's help them do that. But thank you all. It's great to see you. So many friendly faces that I'm immensely grateful for. Yeah, let's actually act. Let's make these things happen. We can't wait for Joe to save the day.
All right. Thank you very much. And it's suffice to say that America and China, both of them before the COVID-19, account for close to 50% of the incremental growth in the world. So I think the world needs America and China to work together. And thank you very much. Thank you very much. And then I'm going to pass the podium back to Don.
Yeah. Thank you very much for both speakers, and one is my boss, and Andrew, I know you'll have a next meeting, so you can go. I just make an announcement that next month we're going to have a joint fundraising for Congressman Ted Lieu, and we just joined the PAC with Humanity Forward PAC, and Ted Lieu's PAC is on August 7th. We're going to talk about Twitter and politics. Both Andrew and Ted Lieu is expert on the Twitters. So we're going to discuss how Twitter affect politics. And also it's very appreciate Glen Fukushima. It's first time I met you. You are talent people, intellectual, and Humanity Forward. Not only campaign, but after campaign, we try to build an Asian American trusted community with the talent. We need more people get involved. You are all smart. And thank you very much. Beautiful human being, use Andrew's word, beautiful human being, Asian American.